So as you mentioned here, there is a push from the Australian side to make the whole process more logistical, moving faster. The emergence of this mobile workforce, in your case, of course, must be attributed to the fact that the Australian government moved the refugee asylum application the application processing procedure to Nauru, right? So why did the Australian government do that? I mean, why they make such an important part, which at least symbolically is very important for the sovereign power? You're deciding whether or not some person is entitled to come in as a refugee. You move away from your territory to another country. I mean, how should we understand the imperatives behind this mobility of the certain part of sovereign power?
Yeah, so the Australian government has a settler colonial history around the enclaving and the marginalisation of particular populations, and whether that be the exclusion and the enclaving of Aboriginal Indigenous peoples, or whether that be, now in this case, migrants arriving or attempting to arrive to Australia, and that has extended from immigration detention centres and other practices of confinement and exclusion in the Australian outback to eventually just subcontracting entire sovereign states, which in many respects is a way to evade responsibility. So if something does happen, and things have happened in Nauru and in Manus, it's a very obfuscated context for finger pointing. So it can be a it's them or an it's them sort of situation. And I suppose you've also seen similar logics develop in other countries with the European government, or the EU, I should say, contracting Turkey or financing Turkey to carry out similar kinds of procedures, and this kind of practice of frontiering that pushes out and outsources migration management to other regions and creates a sort of a border-making practice externally. The US government has been doing similar things in Central America as well.
Just to clarify, this does not necessarily mean Australia or EU actually is reducing the number of refugee status that they're issuing, right? It's just mainly outsource the process, the middle process of determining their status. Is my understanding correct?
Well, no, because what they're actually doing is they're contracting these countries to then take those people once they've been assessed. So their refugee visas are then tied into those countries and not into the original countries that those people were trying to direct their asylum claims to. So it's a way of essentially confining
even these
those
people are granted the refugee status, they are not allowed to come to Australia.
Yeah, so it's a way of, so I should say it's not only a way of evading responsibility, but it's a way of
offloading refugees altogether.
Offloading migrants, and a lot of border spectacle. There's a lot of symbolic capital around this spectacle of the borders that the Australian government is, in particular, has found very geopolitically useful in campaigning around campaigns such as stopping the boats and we will determine the manner in which people come. And so it's a way of essentially corralling populations. And I should say it's actually very small numbers of people in the Australian case. In Nauru, it was around 1,300 migrants making asylum claims who were actually sent to Nauru. In relation to Nauru's population, that's quite significant. But it's a very low number, so it's much more about the spectacle as opposed to the realities of people. But it is a way to cordon those people and externalize them from the country into another region.
So my final point is, based on this case, do you think it tells us any major change in the world order, either in political terms or in ideological terms, and especially if we consider the role of this mobile workforce. As I said, they are kind of middle level, they are foot soldiers, and they are the real people who make such a system possible, right? I mean, if we look at them, what their activities tell us about the world that we are living in.
I think it's a form of governance over mobility through a different kind of language, through a language of protection, a language of liberal humanitarianism, and that's also reflected in the workforces that come together, not just security firms through explicit border making practices, but also people who are trained in this now very institutionalized industry. And also, I would say, too, the different forms of capital that are extracted from people who move, because individuals are coming into these workforces from very moral standpoints of wanting to support people and feeling like the asylum system is a very effective way of doing that. But at the same time, as explicit financial capital is being reaped, you also have various other forms of capital that can be moral capital as well as geopolitical currency. And this is a kind of a reshaping and an outsourced frontiering that we've seen in many other regions of these fly-in, fly-out workforces coming together to make this system of governance a possibility.
I see. So just to clarify, you are saying actually these people actually are not, we should not regard this mobile fly-in, fly-out workforce as unconditionally supporting this system. In a way, they are victims as well. They are being exploited. In some cases in moral terms, right? Because they joined this cause out of their concerns, genuine concerns of refugees. But then the only way for them to get into this field of practice is by working with or for government. Is that what you mean? There is a moral value being extracted from them, from this mobile workforce.
In some respects, yes. I mean, I think people will have maybe make quite strong statements about not wanting to be contracted into controversial context in this kind of outsourced capacity, like Nauru or perhaps Central America or Northern Africa and these kinds of outsourced frontiering projects. And so they might then just be contracted into these various workforce arrangements in countries where they see it as a much more benevolent system. So Australia, for example, and would refuse to take on contracts in controversial regions. So people come at it from different angles and will then have reasons or regions in which they will agree to work or not agree to work.
Great, yeah. I think another takeaway point for me from this conversation is also, actually all these actions and the very complicated arrangement, in a way, reinforce the humanitarian language, at least, right? Australian government certainly is not saying that we are against humanitarian concerns. They said we support humanitarian principle, but yet the way they do it is in a very through this very sophisticated outsourcing, both spatially and also institutionally, by having all the private actors involved, right? So therefore, I think this kind of helped me to understand why, on the one hand, we see the increasing prominence of humanitarian discourses in the mainstream public media, right? As if it is really a global consensus. But at the same time, we do not see these humanitarian principles are being implemented in the real lives of refugees on the ground.